until I just remind it. Good evening, everyone. I'm told that we are now connected to YouTube, so all is well. Friends, distinguished guests, everyone watching on YouTube, as we hope you now are, apologies if you saw a little delay earlier, and welcome to this meeting of the London Transport Museum Friends. We are meeting for what I'm sure will be an interesting and informative presentation on transport heritage in New South Wales. But we are, of course, aware of the very sad events being played out on a larger stage, both in this country and across the world, following the sad news of the Queen's death last Thursday. So before we start our proceedings, could I ask you please just to stand in a minute's silence in memory of Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Howard Collins, who is, I know, known to many of you. We were able to maintain, during the depths of the pandemic, a meetings programme by recording presentations exclusively on YouTube. And one of the most memorable of those was that given by Howard from his now home in Australia. Indeed, he was so enthusiastic that he got up at some incredible hour of the Australian morning to join us in the live chat for the pre-recorded meeting. So now it's time for an update. It would be nice to say that Howard has flown all the way from Australia just to give that for us. That's not quite true. He has come across for some other reasons too, but he has very kindly allocated some time this evening from what I'm sure is a busy schedule to update his talk on transport heritage in New South Wales. So without any further ado from me, Howard, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just go and switch my microphone. Does that work? Can you hear me okay? Am I tuning in with anyone who's hearing me okay? Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me, Barry. It's great to be back. What I thought I'd do first, though, rather than start with the presentation, is I want to give you a few anecdotes of royal experience, because I thought it would be fitting as a tribute to our late Queen to describe a few things that happened to me along the way in terms of royalty. Two of them stick out, and I've met the Queen 4 times, I think probably far less than Peter and many others who are here today. But one I do remember, and I haven't got any slides up, but I'll tell you about it, was at Aldgate Station to thank the staff to deal with the London bombings. The Queen came along to visit the station, open a plaque. And one of the things you do before you have a royal event is you get an email saying, Howard, would you mind popping over to the park and coming to see the private secretary to talk about the royal event? So I was very nervous because I thought, how do you actually get into Buckingham Palace? You don't just turn up at the front door, but apparently you do. Just on the right-hand side, there's a little place. I turned up thinking, I've got a long way to walk across that gravel, and are they going to turn me down? But I gave my name. They said, oh, yes, Mr. Collins, we're expecting you. The Assistant Private Secretary of the Queen is expecting you. I went to this little anteroom with the horse and hound on the table, a few things. I walked on the corridor. And what was interesting walking on the corridor, the carpets were quite threadbare. You remember those old round sockets that you had for your plugs and your lights? They were still there in evidence. I went past what looked like a paternoster lift, and then we went into the Assistant Secretary's room for a cup of tea. The china was superb. And they said, Howard, we're looking for a money shot, something which hopefully we can get on the front pages of all the newspapers. So my media person was there and we said, well, we have this thing, when people retire, we ask for a vitreous enamel sign to be put together with their name on it, Joe Bloggs. It's a beautiful sign, it's framed in wood. Excellent, they said, yes, what should we put on it? And I said, well, how about Buckingham Palace, as a station? I said, that was very good. Yep, we'll do that. So day came, I handed this sign, a very heavy sign, but I held on to it, didn't give it to the Queen, but I handed it to her, and she had that smile, which was one of her wry smiles. So afterwards, when we had lunch upstairs, round this table while I was sitting next to the Queen, and there were train drivers and station staff who were so nervous their cutlery was rattling, and she diffused it all by saying to one of them, how does one drive a tube train? Was her first comment. And by then they all sort of turn this, do this. And she said, Mr. Collins, I just want to say how fantastic this sign is. I said, why is that? He said, there is some nutty professor who thinks there's an secret underground station in Buckingham Palace. So what I've agreed to do with the Assistant Private Secretary is we are going to walk him through the basement. We're going to put your sign in a room with the light on, just the door slightly ajar. This is a gospel truth. And she said, we're going to walk him along there. And as he gets to that point and catches a little glimpse of that sign, we're going to slam the door and say, no, nothing to see here, and move on. That is a true story. That is absolutely a true story. Many others I probably will write in my memoirs or whatever, but God bless our Queen. She did a fantastic job. And I think she was a secret railway spotter, wasn't she? She loved trains. She loved turning up. Great to see her for the Elizabeth line opening. So that's my anecdote and dedication to our late Queen. So here we have, not the Queen, but the Governor of New South Wales, along with the Deputy Premier. And do you recognise that tall, handsome gentleman? I'm not talking about the one on the right, but this one here, that's Rob Mason. You remember Rob Mason, who was, I think he was in the cleaning services manager once, but general manager of the Victoria line, before he decided he would go to Australia. And I can thank Rob that he was one of the guys in 2012 said, Howard, we're having a reorganisation, a bit of a clear out. Do you fancy coming over? So this is part 2 of something I did from my bedroom last time, which was to talk to you, actually. In the middle of the night, I think it was something like 4 in the morning, or it might have been 3, I can't remember. Anyhow, I just want to give those people who didn't see that, and it is still on YouTube, it's not quite as popular as the Kardashians, but hopefully you'll be able to watch it. I just want to give you a little glimpse. 45 years ago, on the 5th of September 1977, I started with London Transport. 6013402. Traffic admin trainee, paid as a clerical assistant. I think, £2,600 a year, if I can remember rightly. There's Collins. Which depot is it? Anyone give us a shout? Golders Green. Gave it away really with Finchley Central on the top. No, I think it does say Finchley Central, but that's a Golders Green 59 stock, is it? Notice the number 59. Vic Petrie, Group Manager Vic Petrie. The worrying thing is Vic is younger there than I am now. God bless him. A lovely guy, athletics club, I think, something. He was a big man in charity. And of course, safety was the number one priority there, as you can see. We're in Golders Depot. Nothing to wear here. Just make sure you keep your wits about you, Collins. And thank God it's black and white. Otherwise, I'd be very ginger in there. And here I am at the museum. I think it's Museum Station, Sydney. It's got London Underground roundels in it. It's got tiles which look like London Underground. That was taken last year. So that's me. And I won't talk any more about me because I definitely want to give you a quick recap of what happened in 2020. Well, we talked a lot about electric trains, if you remember. Right? Now, those of you, Graham, this is, if you got in this 1926 F-set, you'd be very familiar. 2-handle, master controller, brake handle, made in Britain, British Thomson, Houston, I think, gear in it. And these guys, John Snyder in the middle, who I've got to thank a lot for helping me understand all about Sydney electric trains. But these two guys, looks like Father Christmas, isn't he? Dave and Alan, I think they still had spares in their lockers at Flemington Depot. And these trains finished in 1991. So when we wanted to get this thing going again, they just came in on their Sundays and did the work and got this going. This is the 40th, I think, official anniversary of the Eastern Suburbs line, which opened in 79. The Great Train Race, I hope you've seen the steam one where we raced 4 steam engines together on the coal line at Newcastle. Well, this is the equivalent of a 26, a sort of 1970s, 80s S-set, and the most modern Chinese Waratah train there as well. Beautiful spot of Lavender Bay, Sydney Harbour Bridge. I'll talk about this a little bit more. And David Bennett, who helped me put this presentation together, and Andrew Moritz, the Australian equivalent of Sam Mullins, actually. I think you knew each other before I knew Andrew. That was 2020. And we talked a lot about the sort of moving heritage as well as the existing. But what's happened since then? Quite a lot, really. I've been really lucky that we've moved this thing, this marvellous, I call it the Australian equivalent of the Flying Scotsman, because, and in fact they have double-headed together. Those of you with long memories will remember the Flying Scotsman coming out to Australia, I think in 1988 or thereabouts, and they've double-headed all the way out in New South Wales. When I last spoke, we were about to launch this locomotive, which had been really not working for 12 years, and then COVID happened. So everything got cancelled. But the good news is, after a long wait, in March 2021, we relaunched this event. Just to give you a little bit of insight of this locomotive, it's a sort of hybrid of Australian and American engineering. The chassis it sits on is a cast piece of steel made in America and then exported. And then the boiler was manufactured either at Everleigh or actually, I think, at Clyde and Engineering. It's a 462, I think, if I remember rightly. It's the biggest, most powerful express passenger train in New South Wales. And it's beautiful. You know those yellow things? They call those the whiskers. I think it's great. Doesn't it look like whiskers, like a cat? The thing which is even better than when it was first built is its paint, because no one spray painted trains, did they, in those days? And some authentic people say, oh, it should have been hand painted. But, you know, I think the engineers amongst you would appreciate the quality of that particular design and rebuild. Since we've launched it in 2021, we've covered over 5,000 kilometres and carried 15,000 people on it across New South Wales. And just to remind people, I'm not comparing sizes. New South Wales is about 7 times the size of the UK. So when you stretch your legs on an engine here, you normally do about 900 kilometres before you think you need to turn back. So there's a story about this which involves the Germans. I've got nothing against Germans. In fact, I'm going to Berlin next week. But do you remember the Tornado? It had a welded new German boiler. I always say, just remember, it was in East Germany, not in West Germany. And there is a difference between a West German car and what was an East German car many years ago. But they were good people. Transport for New South Wales, before I arrived, decided they would have a new boiler welded up. And that was it. Went off to Germany, I sent a couple of engineers. Yeah, it looks like. Brought it back. It didn't fit. It was slightly off of centre. And also when the engineers clawed inside, and I've learnt a lot about stays. You know about stays, these things which hold the boiler together? Apparently it didn't have enough for the Australian standards. So it went back to Germany again. This has taken a year or so. They tried to straighten it up. They put more stays in. They did all they thought they could do. It came back again. And the engineers said, look, this is not going to work. So they got the old boiler out, which was condemned, and literally rebuilt it. Huge steel fireplate. I'll show you some photographs of some people who were inside that thing for months, putting in over 4,000 stays, new backplate, new firebox, everything basically. It's a bit like Trigger's broom. There's nothing really left of it, but the front bit was all good. A superheated steam boiler, and this is it going back in. And at Chullora, where this was built, it was a slow progress because most of the engineers who were doing this work were in their 70s and 80s. They still had those skills. They just didn't go as fast as they did when they were working on these things in the 50s and the 60s. And there she is, 3801. Notice the terminology. It's not 300 or 3801. It is 38 class, and it's number 01, the first one. And
Train spotters are chuffed at the imminent return of 3801.
After a decade-long restoration, 3801 will return to service this weekend, offering heritage shuttle rides across Sydney. Volunteers say she'll take your breath away.
A day you've all been waiting for, and a day which I'm sure some thought might never happen.
Today you are actually sharing in the history of seeing this iconic steam locomotive in operation again.
We describe 3801 as a legend of steam for the pride and the romance it brings to New South Wales Railways.
I would like to say thank you, every one of you, as volunteers. You've done a great job. And I'm really, really excited about getting on this train. Thank you.
I am proud and honoured to officially launch 3801 on behalf of the people of New South Wales.
That's more exciting than me speaking, isn't it? Hey, wasn't that fantastic? Now, these enthusiastic young men and a young woman, there's one there, have all played their part in the 12-year battle to get this thing back up and running. Peter Lowry, the former chair of Transport for New South Wales. I can see James Dalton, who's the head of the Australian Rail Historical Society. This guy here, Mackay, Bruce, fantastic guy. Lots of them. They all, I remember this person here, I can't remember his name, he was in the boiler at about 40 degrees trying to sort of drill out these particular rivets and stays. Everyone contributed to it. And of course, for some of them, this was almost the last thing they did. In fact, a couple of the people were here, I can see in the photograph, are no longer with us because it was a lifetime's work. And it was a great event. And I pay my respects to all those people there and many, many more who did a fantastic job for us. And then we took it out and about. We can't, one thing I believe it is, I love museums, Sam, I love museums, but also, as you know, Sam, I love the Sarah Siddons and the 38 stock and Steam on the Met. Getting the thing out and about, getting the community engaged. We took this train to Albury. That's almost on the Victorian border. That's 900 and something, 800 and something kilometres away. I love that. Couldn't that be more Aussie, that photograph on the left? The guy with his hat on, waiting for the train. We went all across southwest Australia. It's got now tours booked for the northwest, the north. And when it arrives, the whole town comes out to see 3801. It's probably the equivalent of you've experienced, I'm sure, with Flying Scotsman or the equivalent. It's great to see. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the Harbour Bridge. But I don't want to talk about, there's some facts there. We celebrated 90 years. In fact, I'm missing out on something that I'm very upset about, but I have to contain myself. We are taking 3801 over the Harbour Bridge on the 25th of September. So if you want to get up in the middle of the night and watch this live experience, it is a money shot and a half, as I'd call it. It's the first time we've ever done that. It's a bit like Sam LU150. We've got to take a live steam locomotive through underground stations to get out on the Harbour Bridge. It's going to be quite exciting. I've got every smoke detector and everything switched off. I've got everything sorted, hopefully. I'm not going to be there, but hopefully it will be sorted. And it will be a fantastic achievement. And we'll celebrate this bridge. And of course, it has a lot of bridge connections. Its design, the steel, most of it came from Dortmund Long, a fantastic British company who built many bridges. It's like a larger version, I think, of the Newcastle upon Tyne Bridge, isn't it, when you look at it? Apparently, it actually it raises itself by 7 or 8 inches when it gets hot. There are over 6 million rivets in this thing. And now that I look after roads as well as rail, I look after the riggers, the painters, and all the people who work on this bridge, some of which are in their 80s and still working. They don't go up to the top anymore. They supervise from down below. But I want to celebrate 2 women who actually, without those 2 women, this bridge would not have existed. And it's really important that Kathleen Butler, who was the confidential assistant to John Bradfield, who is the engineer in charge, she did all the documentation, the tendering, the 1922 submissions for the successful tender. And as soon as Dortmund Long won the bid, she came over to the UK. She was really a qualified person without qualification. She made sure the bridge happened on time, and amazingly was the only woman in the management team to be involved in the bid and in the bridge build. Across the pond in the UK, you may know that the first woman chartered civil engineer was actually her opposite number for Dortmund Long. And Dorothy Buchanan, if you go to 1 George Street, you'll see there's a room dedicated to Dorothy Buchanan. And she was the lady who met Kathleen Butler, and they went through the paperwork, got the design back to Australia, and started the importing and the 10-year construction. And I think for all us blokes in the room, I think it is important to remember, even then, 2 women were actually responsible for what I think is the most iconic building, certainly in Australia, or structure in Australia. So we had a bit of fun celebrating 90 years. There on the left is the grandson of John Bradfield, who was the Frank Pick of Sydney's electric railways. He went around the world, Boston, London, New York, I think. He also went to Moscow. He looked at a number of electric railways and came back in I think just before the war, came back and said, I've got to have an electric railway. It's the only way forward. And started to build the City Circle Line. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The City Circle Line. And that's his grandson who was there at the event. It's a transport event because the road bridge originally had 4 rail lines, 6 roads, so we had buses, vintage buses. Our electric train came out again, and I'm going to show you another video so you can enjoy someone else's wonderful
Get your papers! Get your papers! Sydney Harbour Bridge turns 90! Riding the 90-year-old train across the 90-year-old bridge is quite a different experience to your everyday commute. The sounds, the smell, the feel of that train really brings back what travel was like in those days.
They can experience how people traveled in the past, the trains they used. or even the buses and the ferries that's running today.
For us to connect the buses with the bridge celebration is a great occasion for us, and it is really part of that history of the bridge.
I told you I'd get some bus things out for people.
So it's great to have events like this organised by Transport Heritage for New South Wales, partnered with Sydney Trains and Historic Electric Traction to make events like this happen to mark the 90 years of the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
One of those cars you saw there was actually the first car which went over the Harbour Bridge. 3426 was the first car which went over the bridge in 32, and it went over the bridge 90 years later. The event, Sam likes his stats because he always likes stats and what attraction and what's the footfall been. You can read all those. All I'd say is it was one of the big events in Sydney. So we were breaking out of obviously lockdown then, and we were starting to get people back into enjoying Sydney once more, and it really did attract a lot of interest and view. It will be replicated again on the 25th of September when we get 3801 across the Harbour Bridge. I want to switch now. Last time I talked about some of our built heritage, and I want to sort of catch up with a little bit of that. I talked about Bundanoon Station, Hamilton Signal Box. I want to share with you another station. Thanks to a former Chief Executive of Transport Heritage New South Wales, Andrew Killingsworth, I managed to sort of get him a new job going around the state, meeting MPs and saying, would you like your community to be involved in one of our older heritage stations? And as a result of that, we got funding to take what was a dilapidated old station and restore it for community use. We're on station, I think, about 10 or 12 now, and we've got another 10 to go. And I think this has been an amazing achievement that we've changed the whole decaying sort of nature of regional New South Wales and their stations into something which has really brought the community together again after COVID. Gunning Station, it's been not used as a station. The trains go through, people get off, but they don't ever go in the station. And in 2022, we did a full restoration, and then we invited the community along. On the left, and that's after on the right, again, we get heritage advisors telling us of what brown paint we should use and what particular sort of colours. But you can see it's made a massive difference. On the left, that's what I walked into. Andrew showed me around in about 2019. And then that's what it looks like today with interpretation, opportunity for local groups to utilise this facility, arts, crafts and everything else. And this was our opening day. This is the whole town of Gunning. I don't think anyone is left. There's a few dignitaries at the front there. I think they're looking okay. But Gunning Station, I think it has 2 trains a day, or XPT and maybe a couple more. They've all turned out. Local school captains there, local MP, there's Andrew Killingsworth, local mayor, fantastic opportunity. And it might feel small, 400 people getting the benefit, but it's changed the heart and soul of what stations used to be, which is the heart and soul of every town in New South Wales. That's what it looks like. Notice this wonderful sort of hand pump that would have pumped the water out. Chimneys, original building built in the 1860s. Blaney, now I talked about this last time. Blaney Station, coldest station I think in New South Wales. Yes, we get snow there as well as temperatures above 40 degrees. We finished the restorations and that's where I left it. But since then we've been back. And we've been back not only with one of these wonderful XPTs, the country Australian cousin of the HST, but also recently we've been back with 3801. And now we've done the interpretation, It is in a full working order and the community are using it on a regular basis. Now, those who are excited about trains, stand by, because this is the first steam engine that the state has bought since it was originally bought in 1954. We bought back from a group of volunteers, 6029, Manchester, I think, built Bear Garrett, and it is now a state asset, which is fantastic, isn't it? I mean, the amazing thing about these locomotives is they did less than 10 years service before they were withdrawn. They'd hardly run in. In fact, the Australian government ordered 50 and then realised there was a thing called a diesel engine. So halfway through the order, they said, oh no, we don't want those anymore. We want to buy some diesels. And Bear Garrett said, no, you've placed the order. I tell you what, we'll give you 42 and we'll send the others in bits as spares, providing you promise not to make them up as full locomotives. You know, that's the deal. You get a few extra spares. So 40 something, I think, arrived with some spares. And they were really special because they had a 16-ton axle load and were able to go into these country little sidings and rural parts of New South Wales picking up grain as a freight locomotive. But they were so successful in the end, they were used for coal trains. Those technical people will know that they produced something like 310,000 pounds of tractive effort. They were a very powerful locomotive. And I'm trying to get this right. 4, 8, 4, 4, 8, 4. I think that's it. Is that, have I got that right? That's how many wheels it's got and axles. And it is a beautiful locomotive. It has a mechanical stoker, so the fireman, what does he do? He just twiddles knobs which send air pressure, so when this Archimedes sort of screw thing puts the coal through from the tender into the firebox, he fires, or she fires the coal in different directions. It's a science. The only thing is you have to wear ear defenders because any person who drove a Bear Garrett was deaf after 5 years because of the sound of the compressed air. There she is in all the splendour. You can't see all the wheels there because it's just so long. It's a massive locomotive. It's one of 4 left. The other 3 are, well, one's in the museum and the other 2 are sitting languishing in Dorrigo, and I don't think they'll be working very soon. But thanks to the 6 volunteers, I'd publicly say thank you for preserving this, and thank you again for allowing the state to buy this locomotive, the first steam locomotive we bought since 1956. But now Transport Heritage has at least 7 working steam locomotives. You need some carriages to pull them. Now, I'm not a great carriage man, but I do know a good carriage or two. I remember the one, Sam, we restored the 6-wheeler. That was beautiful. And what was happening is we were towing people around in our marvellous heritage trains in pretty grotty looking carriages. So we spent some money now on getting the fleet restored, and you can see an example there, not lavish, but New South Wales green, beautiful seats, improving the outcome. And we want to raise the bar further because we've got some super first class carriages, because we believe, like I think the UK has, that we can raise the bar when it comes to trips. You know, when we were all train spotters, it didn't really matter what you sat on. You did all the journeys and travelled over the tracks you hadn't done. But for most people out there, it is about quality experience when you're going to the Hydro Majestic for tea or you're going to the Southern Highlands. And there's some examples of some restoration. Now, electric trains, we haven't forgotten those because when you've done one, you've got to do a second, haven't you? So this is a second vintage set that I have been secretly working on with a few friends. These collection of carriages is what's known as a W, although that's got an S at the front there. There's a W set. And notice those things in the middle, they are double-decker. The first double-decker trains in Australia. We believe it is really the first serious double-decker in the world. Bulliard built something, didn't he? I think but it was sort of 1.5 decks, and you had to step on someone's head to get out, didn't you, in the morning, as you left, as you left Victoria or somewhere. These are Tulloch cars, and we've chosen, there was a British CEO came out, a bit like Chris Green, who painted everything red. There was a British CEO came out, I've forgotten his name, we'll come back to in a minute, who painted everything bus, rail, blue and white. So in celebration of that, we've got this double-deck car here, blue and white. That is about to hit the streets, hopefully in the next few months. That'll be out running on our 1500 volt DC network. And there's a few of the guys. Again, was locked up in a shed for 14 years. There's a few guys there again. And what I like about this photograph is there are lots of young people who are actually not interested in, would you believe, the flow of air of the Westinghouse brake. I don't understand why not. But they like 1960s design. One of them does the artwork for the replica posters. One of them does the seating maquette and the interiors. One of them does the artwork, the youngest of which is 16. And I think this is a really good sign, particularly for electric traction, is a lot of these people are the next generation to take it forward, which would be fantastic. And there's the famous clock tower at Central Station, and that's at Everleigh Sheds. And notice the statutory shorts for most people. That's a good friend of mine who really did save these trains from the scrapyard in the 1980s. XPT, 40 years and still going strong. I was very upset this morning coming out from Devon. I had to go in one of these Schuko, whatever they are, Hitachi electric things where the floor vibrates because the engine's underneath, rather than my good old HST. But you can still come out if you want to come to Australia and ride on an equivalent. The cousin, it is wider, it isn't the same, although it looks the same design, the bodywork is wider. It has a different off-road bogie. The reason for that is our track is so bad you wouldn't be able to put an HST bogie on this track. But it celebrated 40 years. And here I am saying goodbye to a good friend of mine, Phil Smith, otherwise known as Keg. You'll have to ask him why his name is Keg. I think he probably is a connoisseur of beer. But he always, up until the day he retired, 50 years of work, wore a white flannel bucket hat, as they're called. So we decided we'd all wear one. And this is at Dubbo Station. And Phil walked through Dubbo Station into the station manager's office 50 years ago, over the same threshold as a young man. And I was with him when we walked out of that office 50 years later. And then we went to a pub in Narromine, and 30 of us. We added up our years of railway service, the 30 of us, and it got to 1,149. So a bit frightening, really. And there was one chap who'd only done 5 years, so gosh. That is what comes with this asset, is the history and people. And I used to travel with Phil, that's 7 hours or 6 hours to Dubbo. And he'd give me, on the front of the cab, he'd give me a historic tour. See that river there? He said, one way flows to South Australia and the other one flows north. He'd tell you about all the sort of diversions of the line, the history of the place, while driving his train to Dubbo. Let's talk about heritage, though. We're very privileged in Transport Heritage that the government gives us money to give to other transport heritage organisations. We have a grant scheme. It's judged independently. What happens is people bid for work, whether it's a tramway museum, the bus companies or heritage societies, and then they assess their bid. And it's a bit like the National Lottery. It's sort of, could be 100,000, could be 10,000, fixed heritage, movable heritage, you can bid for it. And so far, we've given over $1 million worth of grants. This is, I think, in 2019, and it's done all sorts of marvellous things. And for volunteer organisations who are struggling to get money, particularly in the pandemic, this has been a very useful form of encouraging people to do things for Transport Heritage. Now, you bus boys, you must recognise this, or do you? This white bus, and that doesn't mean its colour, came from Cleveland, Ohio, and as it says there, was built in 1926 and was the state's first bus, or one of the first buses, because like London Transport or Passenger Transport Board, the actual state nationalised the bus companies, most of the bus companies, and this became one of them. And I'm sure Peter and Leon have seen this when they last came out at the Bus Museum. It is almost ready to go, thanks to a big grant that we were able to give them through Heritage. It has a petrol engine, would you believe? I think it's an enormous sort of litre-sized petrol engine. It's a wooden body, clad with a bit of metal, and an American chassis. I just can't wait to see that. You can see it on the left there, on the Manly route, the 144. A fantastic example of vintage bus, which will probably, once it gets going, will be almost 100 years old. And trams, I'm sure there's a few tram people here as well. 1899, a Sydney D tram set. Again, the chassis ended up in someone's field. The guy who bought it for preservation bought it in 1961 when it left service and kept it basically on a farm somewhere for many years until the Tramway Museum got it back and got a grant, and it's out there resplendent again. Used in North Sydney, was originally, I think, a trader car and hauled by steam, and then became an electric vehicle with a side pole, and then eventually with the top pole on it. And that's at the Loftus Tramway Museum. Now, I have been very fortunate that someone who's been here is my minister, David Ellett, has actually visited, thanks to Sam. He was here in April, I think. He is a heritage person. He's got a degree in Australian history. And the one thing he said to me, he was on holiday, he said, Howard, I want to come to the Covent Garden Museum. He didn't say, I want to go and see the Tower of London or Buckingham Palace. And he spent with, thanks to Chris and a few others, in fact, they could get rid of him. You know, sorry, David, but I know you're probably watching at some stage. But he loved it so much because he really appreciated what London had done in terms of heritage. So a couple of things that have been supported not only by our current minister, but by Andrew Constance, our previous minister, was a few things that we have stolen, really. I have no original thought at all. I just borrow great people's ideas. And Hidden London inspired a lot of people to say, we've got a few things in Sydney we could do the same. And here is St James's Tunnel, a station which is half built and then was never extended, became an air raid shelter in the war, Second World War. And this is a sort of art picture of what it could be. Tours. Sam's going to give me all the pitfalls and the benefits of his knowledge to understand what we can do in Sydney. So in a few, maybe 6 months' time, or maybe even a year's time, you'll be able to come out to Sydney and enjoy Hidden Sydney, Undercroft of Central Station, Moortree Station, St James's Tunnels, and goodness knows where else. Yes, you could do the bridge climb over the bridge, but why not do a subterranean equivalent underground? So I look forward to sharing more with you on that. But the other thing is railway heritage. You know, I've seen many lines. I worked at the Tenton Railway Company for many years before it opened. You know, little lines extending, struggling. You know, Bluebell Railway took a long time to get its extension. Well, we have just received a $14 million grant to extend the Heritage Railway, which Transport Heritage run from Thirlmere at the moment to Buxton, just there, all the way down to Colo Vale. It was the main line originally in 1867, but they couldn't get big coal and freight locomotives up the hill, so they built a diversion. Can you see Bargo, Tarmore? That was the diversion where the gradients were reduced from 1 in 30 or 1 in 33 to about 1 in 40 something to get these big freight locos up. And this became a little bit of a branch line in the end. We've got money to restore it, and we're starting We've started already, and I can share with you a little bit of that history.
It's been a sleeper for almost 40 years, but an historic stretch of rail line in the Southern Highlands is about to be rekindled, and it will be just the place to go if you love steam trains.
Big Hill Cutting in the Southern Highlands was once the biggest rail cutting in the Southern Hemisphere, with trees seemingly perched peering into its belly. It's been many a year since its walls have funnelled the hiss and breath of the Iron Horse.
This was the main rail line connecting Sydney and Melbourne. Our troops went off to war along this track. Our agriculture and goods moved along this track. It was very significant for its time.
But now the cutting will again cradle the steam-driven engine. $9.1 million funded by the state government to refurbish the abandoned rail spur attached to the New South Wales Rail Museum at Thirlmere.
Now you'll be able to get all the way to Colo Vale. That's 32 kilometres of rail, and this is a great recovery project that's going to take this state forward.
The train line slicing through the shires of Wallandilly and Wingecarribee, still bearing the scars of the Black Summer fires on charcoaled tree trunks.
We've been hit with everything here at Wallandilly, and with this news we've got today, this is fantastic.
The extended line will add extra lustre to the country's largest rail museum, which already draws 60,000 people each year. Because as the boss knows, for railway buffs, you've got to get on board.
It's a private railway, very unique in Australia to have your own private railway. That's what the kids really want to see. That's what Grandad wants to bring the grandchildren for.
Mike Dalton, 9 News.
And that is as it was built. You can see the bridge is slightly more robust than that nowadays, but not sure where I'd want to go on that one. And there's, you can see the original line being extended now to Colo Vale. And yes, people are already talking about how do we get to Mittagong. Unfortunately, there's a missing bridge which has to be put back. But 32 kilometres is far than adequate, isn't it, for a rail heritage. And I think one of the things we have noticed is for Thomas Days and a lot of heritage days, a sort of hour and a half round trip is the max. So we're not going to be running trains end to end all the time. We're going to do a mixture match so that you can do the long trip or you can do a shorter one as well. Another video saves my voice.
Today is an exciting day for the Loop Line Upgrade Project.
Don't know whether we
We're taking
can
delivery of 20,000
get the volume up a little bit.
second-hand steel sleepers to help us restore our track. The sleepers we are receiving today are being delivered into stockpile locations at the town.
This is sustainable railway. This is someone else's sleepers.
And are being set aside ready for installation when we start upgrading the track. Much of the track along the Loop Line between the villages of Buxton and Colo Vale is quite dilapidated. Steel sleepers play a crucial role in the Loop Line project. They sit underneath the rails and hold them together in gauge and provide a safe and stable track formation for our trains to travel across. They'll be progressively installed over the next few months. We're fortunate to have received these sleepers today from the Australian Rail Track Corporation, or ARTC's Inland Rail Project. The sleepers being delivered today have been transported by
Notice it's
road
raining in
by
Sydney.
local
It's been
contractors
raining for the last
Southern
6 months.
over 700
We've just given you your weather.
north of Moree, New South Wales. The delivery of these 20,000 steel sleepers is one of the first big steps required to open our track through to Colo Vale. Without sleepers, this project could not have happened.
Daniel had a lovely haircut then, didn't he? It was just for the film. The last thing I want to talk about, conscious of the time, it really is about Chullora. You have Acton. We don't really have an Acton where we can, store things, put things, in storage, but also do repair work. So the old, really this, in London transport terms, this is the Chiswick and the sort of Acton Works of New South Wales. It's about 20 kilometres west of Sydney. They built buses, they built parts of the Circular Quay station, locomotives, all at Chullora. The last manufacturer left in 2006 when they moved out, UGL moved out, and this has been a pretty empty site. Again, securing funding from government, we're now going to build the Transport Heritage Hub. The idea is that any rail private operator, historic operator, can come in, get their locomotives serviced, form up their locomotives, and they're ready to go to get into Sydney. And there are many other organisations other than Transport Heritage who run steam locomotives or even heritage diesels. Also in the corner, in the tank store, as it's called, that's where they built tanks in the Second World War. We're putting into deep freeze the hundreds of rail assets that we still have, which just need to go undercover and be preserved. They'll be taken out in 50 years' time or 20 years' time, because I think we've all learnt you must build quality rather than quantity. If you try and do everything in heritage, you fall flat in your face. If you focus on a few great things, you achieve great outcomes. So Chullora is on its way. We've let the first contract. We'll start to build the storage area for the rail assets and then the service centre. And eventually, like Acton, we'll have an office there as well where Transport Heritage can operate from. So we've seen, like Sam's talked to me earlier this evening actually, record return to Transport Heritage. Everyone has come out from COVID like crazy things. They want to get back on heritage. And we've seen record numbers at Transport rail sites, Thermil. Thomas Days, we've been overwhelmed by buggies, kids and trams and, you know, everything you can imagine, as they love those days. And we have seen some major uplift in things like sponsorship, an arrested decline of what was a hardcore of members who were not, you know, were getting more senior and senior. We've started to see younger people join us. And the community of stations has really reinvigorated people to enjoy the fact that rail is on a bit of a renaissance. And we are spending billions of dollars on new rail, 3 metro lines, upgrading the existing line, a new regional fleet to replace the XPT, and a new intercity fleet. So there's a huge amount of investment in new, but there's corporate memory and historical memory which needs to be retained. And before you can ask me anything you like, really, I just wanted to share with you, my wife is in the audience. She thinks I'm going away to do something, you know, important with work, but I'm sneaking off to learn to drive 3801. I've done about a couple of hours so far under the guidance of an excellent railway instructor, but I tell you, it's like driving a Rolls-Royce. It is a beautiful locomotive, and I think something which I aspire to. And in a few years' time, this will be my full-time job, maybe. Anyhow, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you very much. We'll go straight into questions, comments, if anybody has any. Right, 2 hands I've seen. Paul first and then Joel. Could you just wait for the mic so that everybody can hear?
Howard, first of all, thanks for a great presentation. Really interesting to see what you're up to down under. Is there a risk that with your operational heritage stock, be it electric or steam, that changes to the railway infrastructure will limit your ability to operate such trains in the future?
I think that is a real risk. Maybe not happening as fast as on the London Underground or the main line here, but we are looking at DTRS and European train control systems. But we have actually, because we move 140 freight locomotives a day through the Sydney network, what will be great is we will have a bit of kit on the train which will work the signalling system right up to when, in decades to come, we might see automatic trains. So I'm hopeful that it won't come too fast, and also we will have the technology to support us, because some of our, God bless them, our freight operators are running 1951 Danish diesel locomotives. So if they can work on that, they should be able to work on a lot of our heritage. But it is a worldwide issue, and I think something we've got to be aware of is that we might, by modernising and making things better, we actually lose some of that moving heritage. And one of the things we've had a problem with is our old electric trains are very wide. And someone came up with a great idea to build gap fillers, which save people falling between the gap of a normal train. But our trains are a little bit too wide. So we're doing a few tests and trials how we can continue to operate on some lines electric trains, but on others where the gap's too narrow, we have to restrict the movement of those trains. So it's already happening. Progress sometimes has a consequence, but I think, for example, bus, there's lots of things about heritage and buses. Australia's pretty laid back about, you can still drive a bus, you can still, doesn't matter, makes a bit of smoke, we have enough coal-fired power stations, what's a bit more smoke? I think importantly though, Australians love their heritage, and certainly I see that continuing for some time to come. So, but a good question. Certainly I know something that your colleague on the right is facing, if how far can the good old Sarah Siddons or the 38 stock go in the future on the tube? Well, we used to take it everywhere.
Thank you, Howard. Absolutely superb. 50 years ago this month, I first went to Australia. I've been going regularly almost ever since, so I've experienced nearly all of the stock.
You're probably on some of those old trains the first time round.
Yeah, I was. The Red Rattlers were still running then, and the Sputniks. But my real question is, are you going to preserve any of the V stock, the double-decker intercities, and what about the XPTs? But also, just one other quick point, when I first went there, I kept hearing RFs. It was only when I realised, I looked around, it was a local body on a Regal 4 chassis.
Absolutely.
There was a pre-select hiss and clank gearbox.
Yep.
And every time I looked around, I couldn't see one. So there was a lot of imported British AEC and Leyland vehicles as well.
Yep.
And they're still around.
Still around.
Yeah.
The Australian bus body manufacturers in those days didn't really believe in bending a lot of steel. So, in an RT, you've got those beautiful round curves and the Routemaster. No, the Australians went, that's it, that'll fit, put it on. So when you look at some of these utility bus bodies in Australia, very solid. In fact, they were built of a bigger gauge than the UK, but they were more utility-like than before, but still had those British engines. In fact, in the bus museum, there are racks of British engines still there as spares, and the guys at the Leichhardt Bus Museum do a great job. And coming back to your first question, if I have my way, and I certainly, I still think have a little bit of influence, the V-sets as they're called, they're the interurban, they're the air suspension 1970s, 80s long distance electric trains which go up the Blue Mountains. Yes, we definitely want to keep a set of those. And the XPT, I again have threatened that one thing I'm going to do is I want to get a power car, 2 power cars, a buffet, and a sleeping car, and maybe then I can go around the whole of Australia on this thing. Doing a young Mr. Grace, you've all done very well. Because they are iconic, and they will still be going for another 5 years. But I've already earmarked, talking to the guys who at Meeks Road, I hope you're listening, make sure you choose the right ones that we keep, the ones which have got their, Paxman engine, beautiful British engine, up to date, and it hasn't done too many kilometres. They do, this is a fact, I believe they do 450,000 kilometres a year, an XPT. And you're thinking, is that possible? The oil never gets cold because they go from Sydney to Melbourne, Melbourne to Sydney, Sydney to Brisbane, Brisbane back to Sydney, then to Casino, and then maybe off to Dubbo. Each of those journeys probably is between 600 to 1,000 kilometres. And then they just come in for a little bit of an oil change and a fill up and off they go again. So they're incredible things. And they are almost as good as a steam engine because they produce as much smoke, actually. They're not like an HST. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Nick.
Is that young Nick?
Nick. You've made my day. Thanks for that word, Howard. I have to keep looking in the mirror and I'll believe it. Fantastic presentation, and it's clear you've achieved a lot, not just in everything we've seen, but in getting younger people engaged for the future, for continuity. has that been a struggle, is the first question, or have you had people queuing down the street to join? And the second question is, with an eye back to people of our generation, my generation and older, do you have an oral history project, for want of a better term, to get the information whilst we can from particularly technical people about what to be aware of for the future?
So I'll answer that last question because it's the one I remember, but I know the other one. I think that is a really good idea. I think we haven't done as much as we had in London, you know, with the oral history of, you know, the Windrush and our West Indian friends and colleagues. A lot of the history of early experience in London transport are so important to keep, and I think in New South Wales, you know, those people are gradually falling by the wayside, so definitely something I'm very keen to do. In terms of young people, bus people attract more youngsters than rail people. I don't know what it is. I think it's probably because the youngsters relate to their school trips, their experiences on buses, and also it's an easy thing. You can jump on a bus, you can do things, it's a sort of like a half a day experience. Whereas for the rail people, it's obviously you've got to learn a lot of things from a safety point of view, but also to contribute, you've got to make an 80 or 90 kilometre journey to go to the museum. So we're trying to think of more, the reason why Chullora is important to us, because we want to apprentice our Sydney Trains employees, if we can, and get them to understand the historical significance, as has been done in the past in New South Wales, of working on old things is also as relevant as working on brand new things as well. So that's something we're doing. But we are seeing out of COVID, more people are interested in the broader aspects of heritage. You know, the days of organising a train trip so you could cover every single rail for 20 hours or something, including some strange coal sidings or anything, they're still there. Don't worry if you're interested in that, they're still there. But a lot of people, it's more about immersion in the total vintage experience. And when they mean vintage, they talk about the 1960s. You know, they've got in their homes furniture my parents were throwing out in the 70s. As you know, it's all come back. And I think young people in their teens and 20s are very interested in that sort of era. And we're seeing more people coming back for the broader interest. We have to, and Sam will know this, for volunteers, you have to look after them from day one. Because if they get a bad experience or not cared for or not given the experience which is positive, they'll say, oh, I'll go off and do something else. So that is so important. And we've got a new person helping us again in Transport Heritage with the volunteer group, which is so important. But a good question, and certainly if anyone's got any ideas, all the youngsters in the audience I can see, if you've got any good ideas of what retains you, let us know.
Okay, anybody else? Right at the back, Richard, and then I see John Carr as well.
Yeah, Richard.
You've mentioned what sound quite large sums of money. How have you been able to persuade the various government bodies to put up that funding to enable you to do what you're trying to do?
I think one of the things for the extension of the line was we had terrible tragedy in that area with the bushfires in 2020. And the community, and you saw Nathan, who's the local member, local MP, and the mayor, you know, they were decimated by the bushfires. It got as far as Buxton, but below there was huge forest fires, bushfires. So this was a way of the government trying to bring back new employment, new jobs, but also the community. And the whole of regional New South Wales are the same. You know, for 2 years, really, we'd been locked down or unable to move. Tourists hadn't come into the country. And one way was, let's try and reinvigorate the community, tourism, and invest. So with some great support from Andrew Constance and also David Elliott, who are MPs, Andrew lived in south of New South Wales, very much a community member of Parliament, and nearly lost his life in the bushfires. And out of that, he came out thinking we've got to do something, which was supporting one of the things was supporting the local community, which included heritage. And I also think the other thing is, today, people want their kids to get an experience of what it was like. And there's a lot of grandparents who, what do I do for the day? How do I entertain these kids rather than being stuck on an Xbox or whatever all day? And actually, some of the kids who, you know, they're sitting there in their pushchairs looking at their iPad, and then the whistle goes or a hiss of steam, and they either drop the iPad or they look up and see this living, breathing thing and get the experience on the top deck of a double-decker bus through Sydney. It just changes, I think, kids' aspects of life. And a lot of people are trying to get out and about, as we've been pretty well incarcerated in Australia for some time. And the government's come up with the money. They recognise, in some ways I think they recognise that getting regional community support through this may, you know, provide them with support when it comes to the election.
John.
Howard, I'm sorry I came in slightly late. I've come back.
Don't worry, there was nothing really. It was just a few old videos. Fine.
Come back from the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, which is doing some Heritage Open Days, which are really something that has been picked up, as you know, from the architectural community. But the interesting thing is that people were spending more listening to we in the LNER Coach Association explaining the history of our coaches and how we maintain them than they were spending in the motor power depot, because to them an engine was an engine. Coaches have different types of skills and different types of stories. If I may, an anecdote. I was out in Australia for the 2010 Ashes, which England won. And there was a splendid, sort of satirical editorial over Christmas in the Sydney Herald, I think it was. And this said, you know, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is a splendid edifice. We've got to respect it and ensure that it's maintained, etc., etc. But think, if we were doing it today, if we had to get it through all the cost benefits and everything, we'd probably have a single track bridge constructed in wood and maximising local materials.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was a salutary point, you know, because our pioneers didn't do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But my question is, what's happening to the Everleigh complex, the original work?
Yes, because if people don't know, outside Sydney, on both sides of the tracks, there's South Everleigh, which was a carriage works, and North Everleigh, which was where actually 38 locomotives were built, and foundries, everything, you know, a huge railway workshop. And there's even, I call it LES, the large erecting shop is where they used to build the locomotives. Some of it now has been taken over by a bank, Commonwealth Bank, also a new developer. But they paid homage to the steel foundry there. They've got the big Davies hammer press. They've really given, you know, what is now a conference centre some heritage existence. On the other side, the carriage works has, since I've been there, has always been up for redevelopment. There's been a scheme recently announced by the government for a mixed use of property, flats, but also retaining, and I've had a little bit of an influence on that, retaining the history of the rail yard and making sure we protect some of the iconic features. And, you know, in some ways, what was a locomotive manufacturing shed now is going to be some tech centre with people with, you know, jeans and sort of iPads and everything. But in many ways, it's moved on. But we are seeing the beauty of that is those buildings don't fall down or get burnt down and disappear. They do get restored, and the heritage, obviously governance role is to ensure those buildings are kept. You know, they no longer will be preserved for railway use, but they will still be there, and people can walk through them and see a lot of the history of what really was the biggest manufacturing location in Australia, where tens of thousands of men and a few women worked building locomotives and carriages. And just to add to your point about carriages, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Certainly when you go out on the Southern Aurora cars from the 1960s, it's nothing to do with the motive power at the front. It's the splendour of the lounge car, you know, the leather seats, the beautiful murals. It's going back in time to when railways were in their halcyon days of the golden age of rail that you can experience again. And I think we do a trip to the Hydro Majestic, which is a 1920s, 30s hotel. You take a vintage train with these beautiful vintage carriages, and then you have afternoon tea in a 1930s setting. That's what a wider audience loves about heritage and railways. And I think you're right, carriages for many people have a wider respect and interest than perhaps the smoky oily thing that I'm trying to learn to drive at the front.
Okay,
thank you.
Anybody else, or are we done? I will pause briefly, but if not, I think
I've got a couple of things that I must give to people now. I've been carrying these all the way from Australia. So bear with me.
You might get something to take back with you, Howard.
I hope not, it's not as heavy. So Sam, by Muscle of Man, because there weren't any women actually, and Horse, this is a book about the construction of the City Circle line, which is for you.
Thank you.
Where's Mr. Catley? Where are you? I'll bring this up to you. You're a legend of something, but you're now a legend of steam. There's your hat.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you very much. Now, have you heard of a place called Imber, have you? Yeah, I don't know, some bloke drives there occasionally, gets lost. The sat-nav has told him to go there. They keep firing shells at him. I went into a second-hand bookshop the other day and I saw this thing and I thought immediately of Sir Peter. So, Peter, little Imber on the down. I don't know where you've got it. Leon will have it if you have. I thought I'd give that to you the other day. Thank you very much. Barry, you've been a great host to me. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks for turning up, because I was thinking it was going to be my wife and Leon and maybe Nick, my old boss. But thanks very much for listening, and I've really enjoyed it tonight, and I'll be back soon. Thank you. Thank you.
Just hold fast, everybody, for the moment, please. Before I say thanks to Howard, just to do the parish notices, which are very brief. You should know, but if you don't, you're now going to be told that next week, Thursday to Sunday, is the Depot Open Weekend, free entry to Friends. So we hope to see a number of you there. The Friends are proposing, as they have done in the past, to open for Friends only the Friends sales stall at Acton on the Wednesday afternoon. We'll confirm that in an email in a few days' time, but that's the intention, so that Friends get first pick of whatever new donated stock the stall has. And then our next meeting here in 1 month's time is on Monday the 10th of October. We move a little bit away from heritage towards the current underground operations. Marion Kelly, who's Head of Safety, Health and Environmental with the Underground, is going to talk on safety on the Underground, evolution and revolution. We will put that meeting on the website in a day or so for bookings. I know not everybody finds the website the easiest to use. What I would ask, please, is if you can't book via the website, it does help if you can, please don't phone or email Susan in the next fortnight, because Susan's going into hospital tomorrow for a routine operation, and she won't be answering her phone and probably won't be looking at emails. So if you can't cope with the website, just give it, I suggest, about a fortnight, and then perhaps an email to Susan would be the best thing to do when hopefully she'll be making her recovery. Right, just three things really sort of struck me in the summing up. One is the similarities with the UK. I mean, building steam locomotives in the 1950s that only saw 10 years service before they were thrown away. and a second heritage train with a rather odd selection of carriages. That sounds very much like the Q stock to me. So we hope to be following you with the Q stock with a second heritage train before too long. The second, which I think really resonates, is how you have demonstrated a passion for heritage transport can be used to engage with the local community and the politicians for the benefit of transport as a whole, I suspect. I think that is a really, really positive story. And the third thing is just your passion, Howard, for heritage. I know it was born here in London, but you've carried it away with you to Australia and built on it to an incredible extent. There are a number of people in this audience, myself included, who've been out to Australia, where you've been a very generous host, and thank you for that. But just to see Howard in that environment and talking to the Sydney Transport Bus Museum and the Tram Museum people, the respect that they all have for Howard because of what's been achieved is remarkable, and that is a great achievement. Now, I have a presentation to make. And it's thanks to one of your colleagues, former colleagues in the audience, Mr. Kim Rennie. You mentioned, Howard, 45 years in transport with just 2 employers, if you regard London Transport Underground, TfL, as one, and now with New South Wales. I have here a memento of your last day with the Underground. This is, I believe, the very special certificate of long service, which had changed in its design, but you specially got an old-fashioned one with all the coats of arms of whatever. And there, I think on your last day, Kim will confirm, there is a photograph of you proudly holding your Underground London Transport certificate of service. So it's reasonably light. It's a better trade, I think, for the book that Sam's got. So just as a memento, not only of those years, but of tonight. If I'm not throwing Howard to the lions, I think he might be prepared to hang around for 20 minutes or so. So if people want to come up and... That's very kind. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Yes, I'm sure if you just want a quick chat with Howard, renew acquaintanceships, we've got time to do that. But for those of you who want to leave, please do so. Or you can linger until about 8 o'clock, although I suspect with the director here, the museum staff will not be too efficient at ejecting people if they're still around. Who knows? But 8 o'clock is the time when we should be out. Thank you, everybody. Safe journey home.